When Alara Vance watched her fiancé's hand slide possessively across her sister's lower back at their own engagement dinner, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She calculated. In the 60 seconds it took for betrayal to crystallize into strategy, she made a decision that would either destroy her completely or rebuild her from the ground up. She walked straight to Julian Marrow's older brother, the man everyone feared, and proposed something unthinkable. If you want to see how far ambition, betrayal, and revenge can take one woman, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. But the champagne had gone flat an hour ago, but no one seemed to notice. Alara Vance stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Marrow Estate's grand salon, watching her reflection fracture across the glass. Behind her, the engagement party hummed with polite conversation and carefully calibrated laughter. Everything about the evening had been designed to impress. The imported orchids, the string quartet, the guest list that read like a directory of power and old money. She'd spent 3 years building toward this moment, 3 years of being the appropriate girlfriend, the sensible choice. The woman who understood that love was less important than compatibility. Julian Marrow had been clear from the beginning. Their relationship was a strategic alignment. Her architectural firm specialized in historic preservation. His family owned half the notable estates in the region. It made sense on paper. What didn't make sense was the way Julian's hand was currently resting on her younger sister's hip. Alara had noticed it 15 minutes ago, a touch that lasted 3 seconds too long during a conversation about Violet's recent gallery opening. She'd told herself it meant nothing. Sisters hugged their future brothers-in-law. But then she'd seen the way Violet leaned into him, the private smile they'd exchanged when they thought no one was watching, and the way Julian's thumb had traced a small circle against the silk of her dress. The pattern recognition that made Alara exceptional at her job kicked in with brutal efficiency. This wasn't the first time. The lingering glances across Sunday dinners, the way they always volunteered to handle errands together, Violet's sudden interest in Julian's favorite authors, his preferred restaurants, the obscure jazz clubs he frequented. She set her champagne flute on the nearest table and walked toward them with the same measured pace she used when approaching a client. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, a sound that usually announced confidence but currently felt like a countdown. "Violet, Mother's looking for you," Alara said, her voice perfectly modulated. "Something about the photographer wanting family portraits." Violet's hand fell away from Julian's arm a fraction too quickly. "Oh, of course. I'll go find her." She disappeared into the crowd with a grace that had always come naturally to her. Alara had spent her childhood being told she was the smart one while Violet was the beautiful one, as if those qualities existed in opposition and couldn't possibly overlap in a single person. Julian adjusted his cufflinks, a tell Alara had catalogued months ago. He did it when he was about to lie. "Your sister's been incredibly helpful with the foundation gala planning," he said. "I didn't realize she had such a talent for event coordination. I'm sure her talents are multifaceted." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but Julian either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge it. He was already scanning the room, probably looking for his next conversation, his next strategic connection. That's what he did. That's what they both did. "I should make the rounds," he said. "Senator Whitmore just arrived, and I promised Father I'd—" "How long?" Julian finally looked at her directly. His expression shifted through several micro-adjustments before settling on confusion. "I'm sorry? How long have you been sleeping with my sister?" The string quartet chose that moment to transition between pieces, and Alara's question hung in the sudden silence like a blade. Julian's face didn't change, a skill he'd probably learned from his father, the patriarch who'd built the Marrow Empire through calculated ruthlessness and strategic marriages. "Alara, this is neither the time nor the place. That's not a denial. You're being dramatic. Violet and I have been working closely on several projects, and if you're interpreting normal professional interactions as something inappropriate that says more about your insecurities, then stop." Alara held up one hand. "I've spent 3 years watching you negotiate. I know what your deflection patterns look like. I know what you do when you're about to lie, and I know what you look like when you're caught. So I'll ask one more time. How long?" Something flickered in Julian's eyes. Not guilt, but calculation. He was weighing options, measuring consequences, deciding which version of the truth would serve him best. 6 months, he finally said. It wasn't planned. These things happen. 6 months. Half a year of careful deception while Alara had been planning a wedding, negotiating with vendors, coordinating schedules with both families. 6 months of being made a fool while everyone probably knew except her. Does she love you? Alara asked. Julian had the decency to look uncomfortable. That's not really... Does she love you, or did you just pick the easier sister? The one who wouldn't ask hard questions or expect you to be anything other than exactly what you are. You're upset, I understand that, but we can discuss this privately. Come to some arrangement. I want you to be honest about one thing. Alara stepped closer, lowering her voice. Did you ever actually intend to marry me? Or was I always just a placeholder until you figured out which option served you better? For the first time that evening, Julian looked genuinely thrown. I care about you, Alara. I always have. But Violet and I, it's different. She doesn't try to fix me or improve me or turn me into some project. She just lets me be. There it was. The truth beneath the strategy. Alara had spent 3 years being the appropriate partner while Violet had simply been herself, and Julian had chosen accordingly. Thank you for your honesty, Alara said. It's more than I expected. She turned away before he could respond, moving through the crowd with purpose. Her mother caught her eye from across the room, probably wondering why Alara wasn't playing the radiant bride-to-be. Her father was deep in conversation with Malcolm Marrow, Julian's father, no doubt discussing business opportunities that would never materialize now. The logical thing to do would be to leave quietly, regroup, handle this disaster with dignity. That's what the practical Alara would do, the one who made sensible choices and avoided unnecessary conflict. But practical Alara had just discovered that sensible choices had earned her nothing but humiliation. She found him on the East Terrace, alone for once. Lucy, Marrow stood with his back to the party, smoking a cigarette despite the Marrow family's public stance against tobacco. He was 3 years older than Julian, taller, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. Where Julian had inherited their father's talent for charm and negotiation, Lucien had gotten the ruthlessness that made empires expand or collapse, depending on his mood. Everyone knew the story. Lucien had been groomed to inherit the family business until he'd staged a quiet coup 5 years ago, forcing his father into semi-retirement and restructuring the entire operation with surgical precision. The Marrow holdings had doubled since then. So had the rumors about Lucien's methods. Alara had maybe spoken 20 words to him across 3 years of family dinners. I didn't realize anyone else was hiding out here, she said. Lucien didn't turn around. I'm not hiding. I'm strategically avoiding tedious conversations about market projections and political donations. Then I apologize for interrupting your strategic avoidance. You're not interrupting. You're the guest of honor. You're supposed to be inside accepting congratulations on your upcoming nuptials to my charming younger brother. There was something in his tone, not quite mockery, but definitely not sincerity. How much do you know? Alara asked. Lucien took a long drag from his cigarette before finally turning to face her. His eyes were the same gray as Julian's, but where Julian's were warm and inviting, Lucien's assessed everything they touched. He was looking at her the way she examined buildings, noting structural weaknesses, calculating load-bearing capacity, determining whether the foundation could support additional weight. I know that Julian makes poor decisions when he's bored, Lucien said. I know your sister is beautiful, available, and apparently lacking in sisterly loyalty. And I know that you're out here instead of in there, which suggests you finally figured out what everyone else realized months ago. The casual confirmation hit harder than Julian's admission. Everyone knew. The entire party probably knew. She'd been performing the role of the happy fiancée while being the only one who didn't understand she was in a farce. You could have told me, Alara said. Why would I do that? Your humiliation doesn't serve my interests. Julian's stupidity doesn't affect me as long as he keeps it away from anything that matters to the business. How remarkably compassionate of you. I'm not compassionate. I'm practical. You should understand that. It's your defining characteristic, according to every conversation I've ever heard about you. Alara is so practical, so sensible, so measured. Like those are virtues instead of just another word for boring. Alara should have been offended, but anger required energy she didn't have. Instead, she felt something click into place. The same clarity she experienced when solving a particularly complex architectural problem. Marry me, she said. Lucian's expression didn't change, but he went very still. Excuse me? Marry me instead of Julian. Tonight if possible, but I understand if you need a few days to handle the logistics. He studied her for a long moment, then crushed his cigarette under his heel. That's a fascinating reaction to discovering your fiancé's infidelity. Most people cry or cause a scene. You're proposing to his brother. I'm being practical, Ilara said. This engagement was always about aligning our family's interests. The business advantages don't change just because Julian decided to pursue a different sister. If anything, marrying you strengthens the arrangement. Your position in the company is more secure, your influence more substantial, and you don't have Julian's inconvenient tendency toward emotional decision-making. Those are excellent reasons for me to marry you. They're not reasons for you to marry me. I spent 3 years building toward a future that just evaporated in the time it took to watch my fiancé touch my sister. I've already sent out the wedding invitations, booked the venue, coordinated with both families. I'm not starting over. I'm not giving everyone the satisfaction of watching me retreat in humiliation. And I'm certainly not letting Violet have the future I planned just because she's better at being uncomplicated. Lucian moved closer, and Ilara fought the urge to step back. He radiated control the way some people radiated warmth. It wasn't comfortable, but it was impossible to ignore. Let me make sure I understand, he said. You want to marry me as an act of revenge against your cheating fiancé and your disloyal sister? No. I want to marry you because it's the most strategically sound option available. The revenge is just an added benefit. And you think I'm interested in being someone's strategic option? I think you're interested in control, leverage, and advantages. This gives you all three. Julian's betrayal weakened his position in the family. Taking his fiancée makes that weakness permanent. You eliminate a potential rival while gaining a wife who understands how to navigate your world. Everyone wins. Everyone except Julian and Violet. Yes, Ilara said. Everyone except them. Lucian was quiet for long enough that Ilara started to realize how insane this was. She was standing on a terrace proposing marriage to a man who terrified most of the people in his own family, and she had no backup plan if he said no. She had nothing except the burning certainty that she was not going to be the pathetic jilted fiancé, while everyone whispered about how Julian had traded up. I accept, Lucian finally said. Ilara had prepared arguments, contingencies, alternative proposals. She hadn't prepared for immediate agreement. What? I accept your proposal. We'll marry as soon as legally possible. I'll have my attorneys handle the paperwork tonight. We'll make the announcement before this party ends. Just like that? No negotiation, no conditions, no... You offered me exactly what I wanted, wrapped in the justification that it's what you needed. The only question is whether you understand what you're actually agreeing to. I'm agreeing to a strategic marriage that serves both our interests. No, Lucian said. You're agreeing to marry someone you don't know, don't trust, and probably don't even like very much. You're choosing certainty over chaos, control over vulnerability. That's fine, I respect it. But don't pretend this is purely strategic when it's really about making sure no one sees you break. The accuracy of that statement should have bothered her more than it did. Does it matter why I'm doing it if the outcome serves us both? Not to me, Lucian said, but it might matter to you eventually, when the revenge stops feeling satisfying and you're still married to me. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. Do we have an agreement or not? Lucian extended his hand, a business gesture, formal and bloodless. Ilara shook it, and his grip was exactly what she expected. Firm, controlled, communicating power without requiring force. We have an agreement, he said. Welcome to the family, Ilara. This should be interesting. He released her hand and pulled out his phone, already making calls. Ilara heard him say something to his attorney about drawing up a marriage contract immediately, something to his assistant about clearing his schedule, something to someone else about making arrangements. This was happening. This was actually happening. Ilara walked back into the party in time to see Julian searching the crowd, probably looking for her. Violet was near the windows where Ilara had been standing earlier, talking to their mother. Neither of them had noticed her yet. Lucian appeared beside her, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. Ready? No, but I'm doing it anyway. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. He walked toward the small raised platform where the string quartet played, making his way through the crowd with the kind of presence that made people step aside without being asked. Alara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was insane. This was possibly the worst decision she'd ever made. But it was her decision, not something that happened to her while she stood by being practical and sensible and appropriate. Lucien picked up a champagne flute and tapped it with a fork, the sharp chime cutting through the conversation. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with the kind of attention he commanded without effort. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," Lucien said, his voice carrying across the salon. "I'm afraid we have an announcement that will change the nature of tonight's celebration." Julian had pushed through the crowd now, standing near the front with an expression Alara couldn't quite read. Violet was pale, clutching their mother's arm. Malcolm Marrow stood near the bar, looking between his sons with narrowed eyes. "Alara Vance and I will be getting married," Lucien Tontbogsin continued. "The engagement between Alara and my brother Julian is dissolved effective immediately. We appreciate your understanding as we navigate this transition." The silence that followed was total. Even the quartet had stopped playing. Then the room erupted, people talking over each other, demanding explanations. Julian pushing forward, his face red. Malcolm Marrow's voice cutting through the chaos. "Lucien, what the hell is this?" But Alara was watching Violet, whose face had gone from pale to stricken. In that moment, Alara saw something that shifted everything. Violet looked devastated. Not embarrassed or guilty or caught. Devastated. She'd actually loved him. This wasn't just an affair or a betrayal of convenience. Violet had fallen in love with Julian, and now she was watching that future evaporate the same way Alara's had minutes earlier. The satisfaction Alara expected to feel didn't come. Instead, there was just a hollow certainty that she'd set something in motion that was going to hurt everyone, including herself. Lucien appeared at her side, his hand settling on her lower back, a gesture of possession that the entire room registered instantly. "We should go," he said quietly, "unless you want to stay and watch Julian try to process this publicly." "No, let's go." They walked out together while the party dissolved into chaos behind them. Alara caught one last glimpse of Julian's face. Shock, anger, and something that might have been genuine hurt. Then the doors closed, and they were alone in the marble hallway. "Well," Lucien said, "that went better than expected." Better? They looked ready to riot. Exactly. Controlled chaos is better than controlled composure. Now everyone's too busy processing the scandal to ask intelligent questions about our motives. He was already strategizing, already 3 steps ahead. This was the man she had just agreed to marry. Someone who thought about chaos the way she thought about load-bearing walls and structural integrity. "I need to know something," Alara said. "Did you know this was going to happen? Did you see me coming out to that terrace and calculate that I'd be angry enough to propose something insane?" Lucien considered the question with the same seriousness he might give a business proposition. "No. I saw you coming and assumed you wanted privacy to fall apart. The proposal was unexpected, but not unwelcome." "Why? Why would you agree to marry someone you barely know?" "Because you're interesting," Lucien said. "Julian picked you because you were appropriate. Your sister is interesting to him because she's uncomplicated. But you saw your entire future collapse, and instead of breaking down, you immediately calculated the best strategic response. You weaponized your own humiliation. That takes a particular kind of ruthlessness I respect." "I'm not ruthless." "Yes, you are. You just didn't have a reason to acknowledge it until tonight. Now you do." He checked his watch. "My attorney will have the initial contracts ready within the hour. We'll review them together, make whatever modifications you require, and file the paperwork tomorrow morning. I assume you'll want to maintain your architectural practice?" The casual shift to logistics was jarring, but also grounding. This was a transaction. Lucien was treating it like one, which meant Alara could do the same. "Yes, I'm not giving up my career." "Good. I have no use for a wife who treats marriage like a full-time job. You maintain your practice, I maintain my business operations, and we present a united front for everything else." "What about living arrangements?" "You'll move into my residence within the week. Separate bedrooms if you prefer, though we'll need to appear convincingly married in public." "And if I want to renegotiate terms later?" "Then we renegotiate. I'm not interested in trapping you into something that doesn't work." This is a partnership, not a prison sentence. Ilara studied him, trying to see beyond the calculated exterior. You're being remarkably accommodating for someone who's supposed to be ruthless and terrifying. I'm accommodating when it serves my interests. Right now, my interests align with making sure you don't change your mind before the paperwork is filed. And after that? After that, we see if you're as strategically valuable as I think you are. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't even particularly kind, but it was honest in a way that Julian had never been, and Ilara found herself oddly grateful for that. I should go home, she said. Deal with my family, figure out what comes next. I'll have someone drive you. And Ilara? Lucian waited until she met his eyes. Whatever happens from here, you can't take this back. Once we file that paperwork, you're committed. Make sure you actually want this before tomorrow morning. I want this. You want revenge. There's a difference. Maybe they're the same thing. Lucian smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that reminded Ilara exactly who she was dealing with. Then we're going to get along perfectly. He arranged for a driver, and Ilara spent the car ride home staring out the window at the city lights. Her phone was vibrating constantly, messages from her mother, her father, friends who'd been at the party. She ignored all of them. When she finally walked into her apartment, the silence was absolute. No Julian's things scattered around, no plans to review for the wedding, just empty space and the consequences of a decision she'd made in anger. Ilara poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, waiting to feel regret. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, sharp clarity. For 3 years, she'd built her life around being the appropriate choice for Julian Marrow. She'd modified her behavior, calibrated her responses, presented a version of herself that fit seamlessly into his world. And in the end, it hadn't mattered. He'd still chosen someone else. But Lucien hadn't chosen her because she was appropriate. He'd chosen her because she'd walked up to him and demanded an alternative that served them both. He'd seen her at her angriest and most calculating, and he'd said yes anyway. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Violet. Please call me. I can explain everything. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Ilara deleted the message without responding. Tomorrow morning, she'd sign contracts that would make her Lucien Marrow's wife. She'd walk away from the future she'd planned and step into something completely unknown. It was possibly the least practical decision she'd ever made, but it was entirely hers. And right now, that felt like enough. The marriage license was filed at 8:30 the following morning. Ilara signed her name 3 times while a court clerk, who looked barely old enough to vote, processed the paperwork with bureaucratic indifference. Lucien stood beside her in the same suit he'd worn to the engagement party, looking like he hadn't slept but somehow still managed to appear completely in control. That's it, the clerk said, stamping the final document. You're legally married, congratulations. Ilara stared at the paper, at her signature next to Lucien's, at the official seal that made this irreversible. 72 hours ago, she'd been planning a wedding to Julian. Now she was married to his brother, and the whole thing had taken less time than her usual morning coffee routine. Thank you, Lucien said to the clerk, already moving toward the exit. Outside, the morning was overcast and cold. Ilara pulled her coat tighter and followed Lucien to where his car waited at the curb, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who didn't make eye contact. I need to stop by my office, Lucien said as they pulled into traffic. Sign some documents that can't wait. You're welcome to come with me, or I can have Marcus take you wherever you need to go. I'll come with you. She needed to see his world, understand what she'd actually signed up for. The Marrow building was downtown, a steel and glass tower that reflected the gray sky. They rode the elevator to the top floor in silence. When the doors opened, Ilara stepped into an office that looked like it had been designed by someone who valued efficiency over comfort. Everything was clean lines and muted colors, no personal photographs or decorative touches. A woman in her 50s looked up from a desk near the elevator. Mr. Marrow, Mrs. Marrow? She said the second title with only the slightest hesitation. Your father called 3 times this morning. He'd like to see you both at 2 o'clock. Tell him 3, Lucien said. And get me everything we have on the Riverside Development Project. All contracts, all correspondence, everything. The assistant, her nameplate read Catherine Blake, nodded and made a note. Lucien continued into his office, and Ilara followed, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. His desk was massive, the surface nearly empty except for 2 computer monitors and a single folder. "Do you need anything?" Lucian asked, already pulling files from a cabinet. "Coffee, water, entertainment while I work?" "I'm fine, but I do have questions." "I assumed you would." He sat behind the desk and opened the first file. "Ask." "What exactly does the Marrow Company do?" Julian always gave vague answers about property development and investment portfolios. Because Julian doesn't actually understand the business. He knows the public-facing parts, the charitable foundations, the social connections, the networking events that he's good at attending. But the real work is property acquisition, development rights, zoning negotiations, and turning undervalued assets into profitable enterprises. "And your father just let you take over all of that?" "He didn't let me. I forced him out when it became clear he was making decisions based on legacy instead of logic. He wanted to maintain the family's historical properties even when they were bleeding money. I wanted to build something sustainable." Ilara moved closer to the desk, looking at the documents he was reviewing. They were contracts for something called the Riverside Project, pages of legal language about development rights and zoning variances. "What's Riverside?" she asked. "A neighborhood on the east side that's been declining for 20 years. The city wants to revitalize it, but they don't have the capital or expertise. We're offering both in exchange for favorable development terms." "Which means you're buying up properties before the values increase." "Yes, it's legal, profitable, and provides housing that the area needs. Everyone wins. Except the people who get priced out when property values increase." Lucian looked up from the contract. "You want to have a moral debate about gentrification right now?" "No, I want to understand how you justify it to yourself." "I don't need to justify it. The properties we're acquiring are abandoned or condemned. We're not displacing anyone. We're creating value where there was none. If you have a problem with that, we should probably discuss it now before you're more deeply involved." Ilara studied the contract, noting the clauses about affordable housing requirements and community investment funds. "You're including provisions for low-income units." "Yes, it's good business and good politics. The City Council approves our projects faster when we include community benefits. So it's strategic compassion. Everything I do is strategic. You knew that when you proposed." He wasn't wrong. Ilara had chosen this specifically because Lucian didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was. But seeing it in action was different from theorizing about it. "Can I look at the rest of the Riverside documentation?" she asked. Lucien's expression shifted to something that might have been curiosity. "Why?" "Because I'm an architect who specializes in historic preservation, and I'm assuming you're going to need someone who understands how to work with existing structures. Unless you were planning to demolish everything and start fresh. Some buildings will need to be demolished, but there are 3 structures with historical designation that we're required to preserve. I was going to hire a consultant, or you could use your wife who already has the expertise and a reputation in the field." Lucian leaned back in his chair, considering her with that assessing look she was starting to recognize. "You want to work on my projects. I want to work on projects that interest me professionally. If some of them happen to be yours, that serves both our purposes." "This isn't charity, Ilara. If you're involved, I'll expect the same standard I'd expect from any professional I hire." "Good. I don't want special treatment. I want legitimate work." He pulled the entire Riverside file from the cabinet and set it on the desk between them. "Then prove you're worth hiring. Review this. Tell me what issues you see and propose solutions. I'll make a decision based on the quality of your analysis." Ilara picked up the file, already scanning the property assessments and architectural surveys. This was familiar territory, reading building reports, identifying structural concerns, calculating restoration costs. The 3 historically designated properties were all from the early 20th century, showing various stages of decay and neglect. "I'll need a few hours," she said. "Take the conference room. Catherine will bring you whatever you need." Ilara spent the next 3 hours buried in documentation, making notes about load-bearing wall concerns, foundation issues, and the challenges of updating electrical and plumbing systems in century-old buildings. One structure was salvageable with moderate investment. Another needed extensive work but had architectural features worth preserving. The third was a disaster. The roof had partially collapsed, water damage had compromised multiple floors, and the cost of restoration would likely exceed the building's value even after renovation. She was drafting her recommendations when Lucien appeared in the doorway. "We need to leave for my father's in 20 minutes, he said. "How's your analysis coming?" "Almost done. Give me 10 more minutes." "You've been at this for 3 hours without a break." "I work better when I'm focused." Lucien came into the room, looking at the pages of notes she'd spread across the conference table. "What's your conclusion?" "Buildings 1 and 2 are worth preserving. Building 3 should be demolished despite the historical designation. The restoration costs are prohibitive and the structural damage is too extensive. You'd be better off documenting the architectural details, incorporating some of them into new construction, and arguing for a variance on the historical requirement. The Historical Society will fight that. Then you negotiate. Offer to create a public archive of the building's history, incorporate the facade into new construction, or fund restoration of another property in exchange for permission to demolish this one. There are options that preserve the historical value without throwing money at a lost cause." Lucien picked up her assessment of Building 3, reading through her structural analysis. "This is thorough. Did you expect less?" "I expected competence. This is more than competent. This is the kind of analysis I'd pay a premium for from an established firm." "Then I'm hired?" "Conditionally. I want you to visit the sites, confirm your assessments in person, and provide a final proposal. If the quality holds, yes, you're hired." It shouldn't have mattered. This was supposed to be a strategic marriage, not a professional validation. But Alara felt something loosen in her chest anyway. She'd spent 3 years being appropriate and accommodating, and in 3 hours of actual work, she'd earned Lucien's professional respect. "We should go," Lucien said. "My father doesn't tolerate lateness, even from family, especially from family." The drive to the Marrow estate took 30 minutes through midday traffic. Alara had been here dozens of times for family dinners and social events, but it felt different now. She wasn't visiting as Julian's fiancée. She was arriving as Lucien's wife, and Malcolm Marrow had not been consulted about that change. They found him in his study, a room dominated by dark wood and leather furniture that probably hadn't changed since the 1970s. Malcolm stood near the window, a glass of scotch in his hand despite it being barely past lunch. "Lucien," he said, "and Alara. Or should I say Mrs. Marrow now, though I'm unclear which of my sons you're actually married to." "The one who asked," Alara said before Lucien could respond. Malcolm's eyebrows rose. "Did he ask, or did you propose? Because the version I heard suggests you initiated this rather dramatic change of plans." "Does it matter who proposed if we both agreed?" "It matters when it creates a scandal that affects this family's reputation and business relationships. I've spent the last 12 hours fielding calls from associates who want to know what kind of circus we're running." Lucien moved to the sidebar and poured himself a drink. "Then tell them we're running the kind of business that prioritizes strategic advantages over social conventions. Alara brings valuable professional expertise and connections. The marriage makes sense. It makes sense strategically. It doesn't make sense personally. You barely know each other." "We know each other as well as most people do before they get married," Alara said. "Better than some." "You knew Julian for 3 years, and look how well that turned out." Malcolm took a long drink, studying her with the same calculating expression his sons had inherited. "You're angry. I understand that, but making impulsive decisions out of anger rarely leads anywhere productive. This wasn't impulsive. This was calculated. Lucien and I both understand exactly what we're getting from this arrangement." "And what is that exactly? What does my son get from marrying his brother's ex-fiancée?" Lucien set his glass down. "I get a wife who understands how to navigate society without requiring management, who brings professional value to business operations, and who won't expect emotional availability I can't provide. What Alara gets is a marriage that won't disappoint her by pretending to be something it isn't." The brutal honesty of that statement hung in the air. Malcolm looked between them, something shifting in his expression. "You're serious about this," he said. "This isn't some revenge plot or temporary arrangement." "We're legally married," Lucien said. "The rest is implementation. And Julian, have either of you considered how this affects him?" "Julian made his choices," Alara said. "He's dealing with the consequences. That's not my concern anymore." "He's asking to see you. Both of you, actually. He wants to—" No, Lucien interrupted. Whatever Julian wants to say, he can save it. This is finished. Malcolm studied his older son with an expression Alara couldn't quite read. You're protecting her. I'm protecting my interests. Alara is now part of those interests. Since when do you protect anything except your bottom line? Since I married someone who's more valuable as a partner than as collateral damage in whatever drama Julian created. The words should have felt like another transaction, but there was something underneath them that Alara recognized, the same ruthless pragmatism that had made her propose in the first place. Lucien wasn't protecting her out of sentiment. He was protecting an asset, but at least he was honest about it. Fine, Malcolm said finally. I won't force a meeting. But you should know that Julian is threatening to make this difficult. He's talking about contesting some recent business decisions, claiming conflict of interest now that you've married his ex-fiancée. Let him try, Lucien said. He doesn't have the support or the leverage. He has our mother's support, and she's threatening to make Thanksgiving extremely uncomfortable if you don't at least attempt reconciliation. Then Thanksgiving will be uncomfortable. I'm not negotiating with Julian through family dinners. Alara had met Diana Marrow exactly 4 times, and each meeting had been a masterclass in polite disapproval. Diana had made it clear she found Alara appropriate but uninspiring, good enough for Julian but nothing special. Alara suspected being married to Lucien wouldn't improve Diana's opinion. There's something else, Malcolm said. We've had some irregularities in the property management accounts. Nothing major, but enough that our auditors are asking questions. Boo! Lucien's expression went very still. What kind of irregularities? Missing documentation for several transactions, authorization codes that don't match our records. It could be clerical errors, but you don't think it is. I think someone's been accessing accounts they shouldn't have access to. I need you to look into it quietly before it becomes a larger problem. Send me everything the auditors flagged. I'll review it tonight. Malcolm nodded, then turned his attention to Alara. And you? Are you prepared for what it means to be part of this family? Because it's not just attending charity galas and looking appropriate at social events. There are expectations, obligations, and very little room for error. I'm aware, Alara said. I spent 3 years learning those expectations with Julian. Nothing's changed except which brother I'm married to. Everything's changed. Julian would have given you space to be yourself. Lucien will expect you to be useful. That's a different kind of pressure. Then it's fortunate I prefer being useful to being decorative. Something that might have been respect flickered across Malcolm's face. You might actually survive this. I wasn't sure you would. They left shortly after, and Alara waited until they were in the car before speaking. Your father doesn't think this will last. My father doesn't think anything lasts except money and leverage. He's not wrong. He said Julian wants to meet with us. Julian can want whatever he likes. I'm not interested in family therapy sessions. What if he actually has something important to say? Then he can say it through attorneys like a professional instead of trying to manipulate family dynamics in his favor. Alara recognized the shutdown, the way Lucien compartmentalized anything that might require emotional processing. It was exactly what she'd expected from him, but seeing it applied to his own brother was still jarring. The irregularities your father mentioned, she said. Are they serious? Potentially. Property management accounts control access to buildings, authorization for contractors, approval for expenditures. If someone's manipulating those systems, they could be doing everything from embezzlement to corporate espionage. Who has access? Too many people. That's part of the problem. My father was generous with authorization codes, and we've never properly audited the full list. It's been on my list to handle, but I haven't prioritized it. Maybe you should prioritize it now. Lucien glanced at her. And why? Because your father mentioned it right after saying Julian was threatening to contest business decisions. That could be coincidence, or it could be connected. You think Julian's involved in the irregularities. I think Julian's angry, feeling betrayed, and probably not thinking clearly. I don't know if that makes him dangerous, but it makes him unpredictable. And unpredictable people with access to business systems are a liability. Lucien was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. What else did you notice during that conversation? Your father tested me 3 times, once about the marriage being impulsive, once about expectations, and once about whether I understood what I'd signed up for. He was looking for cracks, seeing if I'd break under pressure or defer to you for answers. And you let me handle all 3 tests without intervening. Because I wanted to see if you could handle them. Did I pass? You're still here, aren't you? They spent the rest of the drive in silence. When they reached Alara's apartment so she could pack her things for the move to Lucian's residence, he walked her to the door. I have to go back to the office, he said, but I'll send people to help with the move tomorrow. Pack what you need. Everything else can stay in storage until you decide what you want to keep. That's efficient? It's practical. You're good at practical. He left before she could respond, and Alara walked into her apartment feeling the weight of the last 48 hours finally settle on her shoulders. She'd gotten married to a man she barely knew. She'd cut ties with her family. She'd started dismantling the life she'd spent 3 years building. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Violet. Please, Alara. I need to explain. I never meant to hurt you. Alara stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Whatever Violet needed to explain, Alara wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe she never would be. She started packing, sorting through 3 years of accumulated life. The books Julian had given her, the photographs from family dinners, the wedding planning binders she'd filled with notes and ideas. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's existence. By the time she finished, it was dark outside. Her phone rang, and Lucien's name appeared on the screen. Yes? I need you to come to the office. Now. What's wrong? I've been reviewing the irregularities my father mentioned. You were right. This isn't clerical errors. Someone's been systematically accessing sealed properties and authorizing expenditures that never went through proper channels. And the authorization codes trace back to accounts that should have been deactivated months ago. How is that possible? That's what I need you to help me figure out. You're an architect. You understand building access, security systems, contractor authorization. I need you to look at these records and tell me what you see. Alara grabbed her coat. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The office was mostly empty when she arrived, just a few scattered employees working late. Lucien's office was a disaster. Files spread across every surface, multiple screens showing spreadsheets and database records. A timeline sketched on the whiteboard behind his desk. Show me what you found, Alara said. Lucien pulled up a spreadsheet. These are properties we've acquired in the last 6 months. 15 buildings, all scheduled for renovation or demolition. Standard procedure is to seal them, cut utilities, and restrict access to approved contractors only. But someone's been accessing them anyway. Yes. Look at these authorization codes. He highlighted a column of numbers. These should have been deactivated after the properties were sealed, but they're showing active use. Door access, security system overrides, contractor approvals for work we never commissioned. Alara studied the records, her architect's brain automatically cataloging patterns. These aren't random. Look at the timing. Every access happens on weekends or after business hours. And the properties all have something in common. They're all in the Riverside development area. Lucien went very still. How did you see that? Because I spent 3 hours this afternoon reviewing Riverside properties. These addresses are familiar. Someone's using our acquisition of these buildings as cover for something else. For what? I don't know yet, but unauthorized contractor work in sealed buildings could mean anything from theft to illegal dumping to corporate espionage, Lucien finished. Someone documenting our development plans before they're public, or setting up the buildings themselves for something. Do we have security footage? Most of these properties don't have functioning security systems. That's why we seal them physically, rather than relying on electronic monitoring. Alara pulled up the property addresses on a map, marking each one. Can you get me the building access logs? The physical ones, not just the digital authorization codes. Lucien made a call, and 20 minutes later, Catherine appeared with a box of physical logs, handwritten records from security companies that managed the properties before acquisition. They spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing digital records with physical logs, and the pattern became clear. Someone had been accessing buildings during the transition period between acquisition and sealing, using authorization codes that should have expired but somehow remained active. This is sophisticated, Alara said. Whoever's doing this understands your systems well enough to exploit the gaps. Which means it's someone internal, someone with access to our acquisition schedules and authorization protocols. How many people have that kind of access? Maybe 20, Department heads, senior project managers, and family, Alara said quietly. Lucien's expression went cold. Yes, and family. They looked at each other across the desk, both understanding what that meant. Julian had access to everything. So did Malcolm. So did Diana, technically, though she'd never shown interest in the operational side of the business. We need more evidence before we start accusing people, Alara said, especially family. Agreed. But we also need to stop whatever's happening before it gets worse. I can visit the properties, do architectural assessments, document what's actually there versus what should be there. If someone's using the buildings for something, I'll find evidence. That could be dangerous if someone realizes you're looking. Then I'll be careful, but I'm not going to sit back while someone sabotages your business. Our business now, technically. Lucien studied her for a long moment. You're taking this personally. Someone's using architectural access as a weapon. That's my field. They made it personal when they brought buildings into it. That's not the only reason. He was right, but Alara wasn't ready to examine her other motivations. She'd married Lucien strategically, but somewhere in the last 48 hours, his problems had become her problems. Not because she loved him or felt some deep emotional connection, but because they were partners now. And partners protected each other's interests. Does it matter why I'm invested as long as I'm useful? She asked. No, but it matters if you're taking risks because you're trying to prove something instead of because it's strategic. I'm an architect investigating buildings. That's literally my job. How is that taking risks? Because whoever's behind this has been operating for months without detection. If they realize you're looking, they'll either cover their tracks or eliminate the threat. You need to understand that before you start poking around. I understand. I'll be careful. Lucien didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Start with the building you recommended for demolition. If someone's using that property for something illicit, the structural damage provides good cover. No one questions why someone's accessing a building that's scheduled to be torn down anyway. Alara made notes, already planning her approach. She'd need proper documentation, safety equipment, maybe a contractor as cover for the visit. This was familiar territory: building assessments, structural analysis, documentation protocols. She could do this. I should go, she said. Get some sleep before tomorrow. Alara. Lucien's voice stopped her at the door. Thank you. For seeing the pattern, for offering to help, for being what I needed instead of what I expected. It was possibly the most vulnerable thing she'd heard him say, and it caught her completely off guard. You're welcome, she managed. She left before the moment could get more complicated, but his words followed her all the way home. For being what I needed instead of what I expected. She wondered if he realized that was exactly what he'd been for her too. Not the safe choice or the appropriate partner, but something more dangerous and more real than anything she'd planned for. Tomorrow she'd start investigating the properties. Tomorrow she'd figure out who was manipulating Lucien's business systems and why. But tonight she let herself acknowledge one simple truth. She'd married Lucien Marrow strategically, but strategy was starting to feel like something else entirely. Something she wasn't quite ready to name. The building on Riverside Avenue looked worse in person than it had in the photographs. Alara stood across the street, studying the collapsed section of roof and the boards covering the ground floor windows. The property assessment had listed it as structurally compromised, but she hadn't fully appreciated what that meant until now. This wasn't a building waiting for renovation. This was a disaster waiting to happen to anyone stupid enough to go inside. She checked her phone. The contractor she'd hired as cover was 20 minutes late, which meant she was standing alone on a mostly abandoned street in a neighborhood that made her instinctively check where her car was parked. The morning was cold and gray, threatening rain, and Alara was starting to question whether architectural investigation was actually her smartest career move. A truck pulled up, and a man in his 50s climbed out, looking at the building with the expression of someone who'd seen too many lost causes. "You're Alara Vance?" he asked. "Alara Marrow now. You must be Tom." "Tom Chen. And I'm going to tell you the same thing I told your office when they called. This building shouldn't be accessed without a full structural engineering team and probably some heavy equipment on standby. The roof's gone, the second floor is questionable, and I'm not convinced the walls are load-bearing anymore. I understand the risks. I just need to document what's here before we make final demolition decisions." Tom pulled a hard hat from his truck and handed it to her. "Then we're going to be extremely careful and extremely fast. We document what we can see from the ground floor. We don't touch anything. And if I say we leave immediately. Understood? Understood. They approached the building together, and Tom used bolt cutters on the chain securing the front entrance. The door swung open with a groan that sounded like the building was protesting their arrival. Inside, the damage was worse. Water had destroyed most of the interior walls, the floor was littered with debris, and daylight showed through multiple gaps in the ceiling where the roof had given way. "Stay close to the walls," Tom said. "The center of the floor is compromised." Alara pulled out her camera and started documenting everything: the water damage patterns, the structural failures, the way the building had deteriorated from neglect and weather exposure. She was focused on photographing a collapsed ceiling beam when she noticed something that didn't fit the pattern. "Tom, look at this." He came over, following her gaze to a section of wall where the water damage was less severe. Someone had installed new drywall recently. The seams were clean, the surface unmarked by the water stains covering everything else. "That's fresh," Tom said. "Within the last few months, maybe." Why would someone install new drywall in a building scheduled for demolition? They wouldn't unless they were covering something. Alara moved closer, running her hand along the edge of the new section. It was approximately 6 feet wide and ran from floor to ceiling, positioned in what had probably been a closet or utility space. "Can we see what's behind it?" she asked. "Not without equipment, and not without knowing whether removing that section compromises what's left of the structural integrity." Alara photographed the wall from multiple angles, noting the precise measurements and location. This was evidence of something, though she wasn't sure what yet. She continued documenting the rest of the ground floor, finding 2 more sections of recent construction, a reinforced door frame that looked completely out of place among the decay, and a section of flooring that had been replaced with newer material. "Someone's been working in here," Tom said, "recently and without permits because any legitimate contractor would have flagged the structural issues immediately." "Can you tell what they were doing?" "Not without more investigation. But my professional opinion? This looks like someone was creating secure storage or hiding something. The reinforced door frame, the new walls, the replaced flooring, that's not random repair work. That's intentional construction." Alara's phone buzzed, a message from Lucien. "Any progress?" She typed back. "Found evidence of recent unauthorized construction. New walls, reinforced doors. Someone's using this building for something." His response came immediately. "Get out of there. Now." Before she could respond, she heard it. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside, doors slamming, voices. Tom heard it too. "That's not your office, is it?" he asked quietly. "No." They moved toward the back of the building, trying to stay quiet. Alara heard the front door open, heard footsteps on the damaged floor, heard a man's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out. Tom grabbed her arm and pulled her toward what had probably been a kitchen, pointing to a door that led to the alley behind the building. They slipped through just as the voices got closer, and Alara caught a glimpse of 2 men in the hallway, both wearing contractor gear but moving with purpose that suggested they weren't here for legitimate work. They made it to Tom's truck without being seen, and he drove 3 blocks before either of them spoke. "What the hell did we just walk into?" Tom asked. "I don't know, but whoever those men were, they weren't expecting anyone to be there." "Do we call the police?" Alara considered it. Trespassing, unauthorized construction, possible illegal storage, all of it was police territory. But if this was connected to the irregularities in the Marrow accounts, involving the authorities now might compromise the investigation before they understood the full scope. "Not yet," she said. "I need to talk to my husband first." Tom dropped her at her car, and Alara drove straight to Lucien's office, her hand shaking slightly on the steering wheel. She'd thought she was investigating accounting irregularities and maybe some corporate espionage. She hadn't expected to find evidence of actual criminal activity or to nearly run into the people committing it. Lucien was on a call when she arrived, but he ended it the moment he saw her face. What happened? She told him everything: the new construction, the reinforced doors, the men who'd shown up while they were documenting the building. Lucien listened without interrupting, his expression getting progressively darker. "You should have left the moment you found the new construction," he said when she finished. "I needed to document it. We needed evidence." "Evidence doesn't matter if you get hurt obtaining it. Do you understand how dangerous this could have been if those men had found you?" "But they didn't, and now we know for certain that someone's using your properties for illegal activity. That's more than we had this morning. Lucian stood and walked to the window, his back rigid. I'm pulling you from this investigation. It's too dangerous. You can't pull me from something I chose to do. I can when it's my business and my liability. You're my wife now, Ilara. If something happens to you because of this investigation, that's on me. I'm not your liability. I'm your partner. There's a difference. He turned to face her. Partners don't take unnecessary risks. And husbands don't get to make unilateral decisions about what their wives can and can't do. I'm an architect investigating buildings. This is literally what I'm qualified to do. Oh, you're qualified to assess structural integrity, not to confront criminals using our properties for whatever the hell they're doing. Then help me figure out what they're doing instead of trying to bench me because you're worried. We're better working together than we are if you're trying to protect me by keeping me out of it. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, and Ilara could see him working through the calculation, his need for control versus the reality that she had valuable information and skills he couldn't replicate. Fine, he said finally, but we do this my way. No more solo visits to properties. You want to investigate? You take security with you, and you clear every visit with me first so I know where you are. That's reasonable. And you stop pretending this is purely professional interest. You're invested in this personally, and that makes you careless. I need you sharp, not emotional. I'm not emotional. You drove straight here instead of going home or taking time to process what happened. You're running on adrenaline and probably some misplaced sense of needing to prove yourself. That's emotional. He wasn't entirely wrong, but Ilara wasn't ready to admit it. What do you want me to do? Go home and wait while you handle everything? I want you to acknowledge that you're in over your head and let me bring in professionals who deal with this kind of thing for a living. What kind of professionals? The kind who investigate corporate fraud and criminal activity without getting killed in the process. Ilara sat down, feeling the adrenaline finally start to drain and leave exhaustion in its wake. Lucien was right about one thing. She'd been operating on emotion since finding the new construction. The fear of being caught, the rush of discovering evidence, the need to prove she was valuable beyond just being strategically convenient. I'm sorry, she said. You're right. I should have been more careful. Lucien's expression softened fractionally. You found evidence we needed. You did good work. But I can't have you taking risks like that again. I need you in one piece. Because I'm useful to the investigation. Because you're my wife. And despite what you might think, that actually matters to me. The words hung between them, more honest than anything they'd said to each other since getting married. Ilara looked up and found Lucien watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. This wasn't supposed to get complicated, she said quietly. No, it was supposed to be strategic and simple, but we're past that now. Before either of them could explore what that meant, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Mr. Marrow, your brother is here. He says it's urgent. Lucien's expression closed down immediately. Tell him I'm busy. I did. He says he'll wait as long as it takes. Ilara stood. I should go. No, Lucien said. Stay. Whatever Julien wants to say, he can say it in front of both of us. Julien walked in looking like he hadn't slept in days. His suit was rumpled, his hair uncombed, and there was something wild in his eyes that Ilara had never seen before. This wasn't the calculated charmer she'd spent 3 years with. This was someone pushed past their limits. Lucien, Julien said, then saw Ilara and stopped. Both of you. Good. I need to talk to both of you. Then talk, Lucien said. Not here, somewhere private, somewhere Father's people can't monitor. Father's people don't monitor my office. Are you sure about that? Are you really sure that everything happening in this company is above board and transparent? Lucien's expression went very still. What are you talking about? I'm talking about accounts that don't reconcile, access codes that shouldn't exist, properties being used for purposes that have nothing to do with development. I'm talking about someone running a parallel operation inside the Marrow Company, and I think I know who. Ilara felt her pulse spike. Julien was talking about the same irregularities they'd been investigating, which meant either he was involved in trying to deflect suspicion, or he'd been investigating independently and reached his own conclusions. Why should we believe anything you say? Lucien asked. You've spent the last week threatening to contest my business decisions and trying to turn family against me. Because I'm not the one you should be worried about. Julian pulled a folder from his jacket and set it on Lucian's desk. I've been tracking the irregularities for months. I thought maybe you were aware and just keeping it quiet, but then you married Alara and I realized you had no idea what was happening in your own company. Lucian opened the folder, and Alara moved to look over his shoulder. Inside were printouts of account statements, authorization logs, and property access records, all documenting the same pattern she and Lucian had found, but going back much further. How long have you known about this? Lucian asked. 6 months, maybe longer. I started noticing discrepancies in the Riverside accounts and started digging. The more I looked, the worse it got. And you didn't think to tell anyone? I was trying to figure out who was responsible before I accused anyone. Do you have any idea what happens if you accuse the wrong person in this family? Father would have destroyed me for creating internal conflict without proof. So instead you started an affair with my fiancée and let me think you were just being careless? Julian flinched. The thing with Violet, that wasn't planned. It just happened, and I know that's not an excuse. I hurt Alara, and I'm sorry for that. But this is bigger than my personal mistakes. Someone's using our properties for criminal activity, and I think it's Father. The accusation landed like a bomb. Alara felt Lucien go rigid beside her. That's a serious claim, Lucien said quietly. I know. That's why I needed to be sure before I said anything. But look at the patterns. Julian pointed to specific entries in the documentation. The authorization codes trace back to master accounts that only Father has access to. The timing of the property access correlates with Father's travel schedule. And the buildings being used are all ones Father specifically wanted to keep, but you forced him to put into the Riverside development. Alara studied the records, seeing what Julian was pointing to. The pattern was there, but it was also circumstantial. Master account access didn't prove Malcolm was personally involved. He could have delegated those codes to someone else, or they could have been compromised. This doesn't prove Father's involvement, she said. It proves someone with access to his codes is involved. Julian turned to her, and his expression was complex. Regret, frustration, and something that might have been respect. You're right, which is why I need access to the properties themselves. Physical evidence that links the activity back to whoever's running this operation. You can't access those properties, Lucien said. Your authorization was revoked after you married Alara. Yes, I know. That's why I need your help. The request hung in the air. Julian was asking his brother to trust him after everything that had happened, to work together despite the personal betrayal, because the threat to the company was more important than their family drama. Why now? Alara asked. You've been investigating for months. Why bring this to Lucien now? Because someone tried to run me off the road last night. My car's totaled, and I barely made it out without serious injury. Whoever's behind this knows I'm investigating, and they're not subtle about making me stop. Lucien's expression shifted to something dangerous. You should have led with that. I'm leading with it now. Someone in this company is willing to commit assault to protect whatever operation they're running. That's not corporate espionage or embezzlement. That's organized crime. Alara felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. The sophisticated access patterns, the recent construction in sealed buildings, the willingness to use violence to protect the operation. This wasn't just someone skimming money or stealing development plans. This was something bigger. We need to call the police, she said. No, both brothers said simultaneously. If we involve law enforcement now, whoever's running this operation will destroy the evidence and disappear, Lucien said. We need to understand the full scope before we bring in outside authorities. And we need to make sure we're not accusing the wrong people, Julian added. If Father's not involved and we drag him into a criminal investigation, it destroys the company regardless of what we find. They were both right, but Alara hated it. Someone had tried to kill Julian. Someone was using Marrow properties for illegal activity, and they were talking about protecting family reputation instead of stopping criminals. What do you want from us? Lucien asked Julian. Access to the properties, your security team, and Alara's architectural expertise to help document what we find. Absolutely not, Lucien said immediately. Alara's not going anywhere near this investigation if someone's willing to commit attempted murder. Then get someone else with architectural knowledge. But we need someone who can assess whether the construction we're seeing is consistent with legitimate development or something else. I can do it, Alara said. Both men looked at her. I already found evidence of recent construction in one of the riverside properties, she continued. New walls, reinforced doors, replaced flooring. Someone's creating secure storage or hiding something. I have photographs, measurements, documentation. If we're going to understand what's happening, you need someone who knows what they're looking at in those buildings. You also nearly got caught by whoever's using those buildings, Lucian said. I'm not putting you in that position again. It's not your decision to make. You're my wife. That makes it exactly my decision. I'm also a professional with expertise you need. You don't get to sideline me because you're worried. Julian watched them argue with an expression that was hard to read. You two are actually married. I wasn't sure if it was just a power play, but you're really doing this. We're really doing this, Elara said, which means I have as much stake in protecting this company as either of you. More, actually, because my professional reputation is now tied to the Marrow name. If this company goes down, I go down with it. Lucian looked like he wanted to argue more, but Julian cut in. She's right. We need her expertise, and we need to move fast. Whoever tried to run me off the road knows I'm getting close to something. They'll either destroy evidence or come after me again. We don't have time for family arguments about who gets to participate. Lucian was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating options and outcomes. Elara could see him working through the problem the same way she'd watched him work through business decisions, weighing risks, measuring advantages, deciding which path served the goal. Fine, he said finally. But we do this together. All three of us, with security backup, and we go to properties that haven't shown recent activity first. We build a pattern, we document everything, and we don't confront anyone until we have proof we can take to authorities. Agreed, Julian said. They spent the next hour planning the investigation. Which properties to visit, what to look for, how to document everything without alerting whoever was running the operation. Julian had a list of 7 buildings showing irregular activity. Elara had already visited 1. That left 6 more to assess. We start tomorrow, Lucian said. Early morning, before most contractor activity starts. Julian, you'll stay with us tonight. If someone's targeting you, you're not safe alone. Julian looked surprised. You're offering me protection? I'm protecting a witness who has information about crimes affecting my business. Don't make it more than it is. But Elara could see something underneath Lucian's sharp tone. Genuine concern for his brother's safety, maybe even the beginning of reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was practical cooperation, which was the closest thing to affection the Marrow brothers seemed capable of. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Stop investigating or the next accident won't be an accident. Elara showed it to Lucian, and she watched his expression go absolutely cold. They're watching us, he said quietly. They know we're working together now. How? Julian asked. We've been careful. Not careful enough, apparently. Lucian pulled out his phone. I'm calling my security team. No one leaves this building without protection, and we're moving up the investigation timeline. If they're threatening us, it means we're close to something they can't afford to have exposed. The security team arrived within 20 minutes. 4 people in professional attire who moved through the office like they were cataloging threats and exits simultaneously. The head of security was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Reeves, who listened to the situation with the kind of calm that suggested she'd handled worse. We'll set up rotating surveillance on all 3 of you, she said, and I'll need access to your investigation files. If there are specific properties we're monitoring, I want my people familiar with the layouts and potential vulnerabilities. They briefed Sarah on everything, the irregularities, the unauthorized construction, Julian's accident, the threatening message. She took notes efficiently and asked pointed questions about who had access to various systems and accounts. This feels organized, she said when they finished. Not opportunistic. Someone's been planning this operation for a while, and they have resources to make threats credible. You're dealing with professionals, not amateurs. Which means, Elara asked. Which means you need to be smart about this. No solo investigating, no sharing information outside this room, and no assuming you're safe anywhere until we know who we're dealing with. They left the office together, Lucien, Elara, Julian, and 2 security personnel. The drive to Lucien's residence felt surreal. 3 days ago, Elara had been planning a wedding to Julian. Now she was married to Lucian, and Julian was sleeping in the guest room because someone had tried to kill him. Nothing about this was going according to plan, But Alara was starting to realize that maybe plans were overrated. She'd spent 3 years carefully constructing a future that had collapsed in an evening, and in the chaos that followed, she'd found something more dangerous and more real than anything she'd planned for. A partnership with someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, not despite her calculating nature, but because of it. Lucien caught her eye across the car, and something passed between them, understanding maybe, or just the acknowledgement that they were in this together now, for better or worse. Tomorrow, they'd investigate the properties. Tomorrow, they'd dig deeper into who was using Marrow buildings for criminal activity. But tonight, they had to sit with the reality that someone dangerous knew they were investigating and was willing to kill to protect their operation. Alara had thought she was being strategic when she proposed to Lucy Yen. She'd thought she was taking control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her reach. But as she watched the city pass by through tinted windows, flanked by security, and sitting across from two brothers who couldn't look at each other without visible tension, she realized she'd miscalculated the most important variable: how deeply she'd care about the outcome when everything went wrong. The second property looked abandoned from the outside, but Alara knew better now. She stood between Lucien and Julian in the pre-dawn darkness, watching Sarah Reeves and her team sweep the perimeter with thermal imaging equipment. 2 security vehicles were parked at either end of the block, and everyone wore earpieces that crackled with periodic status updates. "Clear on the east side," someone said through the comm system. "West side clear. No thermal signatures inside the building." Sarah nodded to them. "You've got 20 minutes. Document what you need and get out. We don't know if anyone's monitoring these properties remotely." They entered through a side door that should have been sealed. The lock had been professionally picked, then replaced with something that looked intact from the outside but opened easily with the right tools. Inside, the building was dark and cold, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dusty air. This property was supposed to be empty, cleared for renovation. But Alara immediately noticed the same markers she'd found at the first location: new construction in a building that shouldn't have seen any recent work, a reinforced door at the back of the main floor, fresh concrete patches on the basement stairs, electrical work that was far too sophisticated for a building scheduled for demolition. "Someone's running power here," Julian said, pointing to a junction box that showed signs of recent use. "That line shouldn't be active. We cut utilities to this property 3 months ago." Lucien photographed everything while Alara sketched the layout, noting which walls were original and which had been added recently. The reinforced door led to what had probably been storage space, but someone had converted it into something else: a secured room with climate control and new ventilation that routed to a concealed exhaust system. "This is professional work," Alara said. "Whoever did this knows how to make modifications that won't show up on basic inspections." "Can you tell what they're storing?" Julian asked. "Not without opening that door, and I'm not doing that without knowing what's inside." They continued documenting the ground floor and basement, finding more evidence of the parallel operation Julian had been tracking. Someone had essentially created a facility within the building, using the scheduled demolition as cover for construction that should have raised immediate red flags. "Time's up," Sarah's voice came through their earpieces. "We've got a vehicle approaching from the north. You need to exit now." They moved fast, slipping out the side door and into the waiting security vehicle. Alara caught a glimpse of headlights turning onto the street as they pulled away, and she felt her heart hammering against her ribs. That had been too close. "Did you get what you needed?" Sarah asked. "Enough to confirm the pattern," Lucien said. "Same modifications, same professional construction. This isn't random." They visited 2 more properties before the sun came up, finding identical evidence at each location. Someone had systematically converted sealed Marrow properties into secured facilities, and the level of coordination required suggested this wasn't a small operation. By the time they returned to Lucian's residence, Alara was exhausted and wired simultaneously. She had pages of sketches, hundreds of photographs, and a growing certainty that they were dealing with something far bigger than corporate fraud. Julian collapsed onto the couch in Lucien's living room, looking worse than he had the day before. "We need to figure out what they're storing in those rooms. That's the key to understanding who's behind this." "We're not breaking into secured storage without knowing what we're dealing with," Lucien said. "That's how people get killed." "Someone already tried to kill me. I think we're past the point of being cautious." Being cautious is how we stay alive long enough to actually solve this. Alara left them arguing and went to the kitchen, needing coffee and distance from the tension. She found Catherine there, somehow already at work despite the early hour, reviewing documents on a tablet. "Mrs. Marrow," Catherine said, "can I get you anything?" "Just coffee, and you can call me Alara." Catherine poured 2 cups and handed one over. "How are you managing? This isn't exactly the honeymoon period most newlyweds experience." "I'm managing. It helps that I didn't have romantic expectations going in. Mr. Marrow mentioned the marriage was strategic, but I've worked for him for 8 years, and I've never seen him bring someone into his operations like this. Strategic or not, you're more involved than anyone he's ever trusted before." Alara didn't know what to do with that information. She'd been operating under the assumption that Lucien saw her as a useful asset, nothing more. The idea that he was treating her differently than he treated other professional relationships complicated the narrative she'd been telling herself. "Did he tell you that, or are you reading between lines?" Alara asked. "Both. He told me to give you full access to company systems and files. That's unusual. And he's different when you're around, more reactive, less calculated. That's very unusual." "Different how?" "He cares whether you're safe. Not strategically safe, but actually safe. When you went into that first property alone, he spent 2 hours trying to track you down before you called. I've never seen him that worried about anyone." The conversation was interrupted by raised voices from the living room. Alara walked back to find Lucien and Julien in what looked like a full argument. "You can't seriously be suggesting we just hand this over to Father and hope he handles it," Julien was saying. "I'm suggesting we need more information before we start accusing people, especially family. Father has access to every system that's been compromised. The timing matches his schedule. What more information do you need? Proof that he's actually involved instead of just circumstantial evidence that could point to a dozen different people." Alara set her coffee down. "What if you're both wrong?" They turned to look at her. "What if it's not Malcolm, but it's also not some external operation?" She continued. "What if someone in the family is using Malcolm's access codes because they know it will create exactly this kind of confusion?" Lucien went very still. "Who?" "I don't know, but think about it. If you wanted to run an illegal operation using company resources, you'd want plausible deniability. Using the Patriarch's codes creates that. If you get caught, suspicion falls on Malcolm first. And if Malcolm denies involvement, it looks like he's covering up." Julien sat down slowly. "That's actually brilliant. Diabolical, but brilliant. Which means we need to figure out who else might have access to Malcolm's authorization codes," Lucien said. "Catherine, get me a list of everyone who's worked in executive administration in the last year, anyone who might have had access to Malcolm's systems." Catherine made notes. "That's going to be a long list." "Then start with people who have architectural or construction knowledge. Someone had to design those modifications, and they're too professional to be random contractor work." Alara felt something click in her mind, a pattern she'd been seeing but hadn't fully processed until now. The modifications weren't designed by an architect. They were designed by someone who understands security systems and controlled environments. "This is engineering, not architecture." "What's the difference?" Julien asked. "Architects design for aesthetics and function within regulations. Engineers design for specific technical requirements. Those secured rooms weren't built to look good or meet building codes. They were built to maintain precise environmental conditions and keep people out. That's engineering." Lucien pulled up personnel files on his tablet. "Who in the family has engineering background?" They went through the list systematically. Diana had studied art history. Malcolm had a business degree. Julien had studied economics. Lucien had studied business and law. Most of the extended family worked in finance or real estate. "There's no one with engineering expertise," Julien said, "which means either we're wrong about the connection or someone hired engineers and used company resources to pay them," Alara finished, "which would show up in the accounts as legitimate consulting fees." Lucien was already pulling up financial records, searching for engineering consultants. What he found made them all go quiet. "There," he said, pointing to a series of payments. "Environmental engineering consulting. 12 payments over the last 8 months, all authorized through Malcolm's executive account, all paid to a firm called Apex Technical Solutions." "I've never heard of them," Julien said. Neither have I, which is concerning because I review all major consulting contracts. Lucien pulled up the company registration. Apex was incorporated 6 months ago. Single owner, no website, no public projects. It's a shell company. Can you trace who owns it? Alara asked. Not easily. The registration lists a management company that lists another management company. It's layered intentionally to obscure ownership. Sarah had been listening from the doorway. I can trace it. Give me the company name and registration details. My team has resources for this kind of investigation. She disappeared with the information, and Alara felt the exhaustion finally catching up to her. They'd been investigating for hours, and every answer just revealed more questions. Someone in or connected to the Marrow family was running a sophisticated criminal operation, and they'd been careful enough to hide it for months. We need to rest, Lucien said, reading her expression. We're not thinking clearly anymore. We're close to something, Julian protested. If we stop now, if we keep going without sleep, we'll miss something important or make a mistake that gets someone hurt. We rest, we regroup, and we continue this afternoon when we're sharper. Julian looked like he wanted to argue more, but he was clearly exhausted too. He nodded and headed toward the guest room, leaving Alara alone with Lucien. You should sleep, Lucien said. So should you. Well, I need to review the documentation from this morning first. Make sure we have everything properly cataloged. That can wait a few hours. I work better when I'm processing information. Sleep can wait. Alara recognized the deflection, the same pattern she used when she didn't want to face something uncomfortable. Lucien was avoiding rest because rest meant sitting with everything that had happened, and he was better at action than reflection. Catherine said something interesting earlier, Alara said. She mentioned you were worried about me. Specifically worried, not strategically concerned. Lucien's expression went carefully neutral. Catherine talks too much. She talks enough. Were you worried? You went into a dangerous situation alone. Of course I was concerned. You're my wife, and you're involved in a company investigation. Your safety affects multiple interests. That's a very clinical way of saying you were scared something might happen to me. I don't get scared. I assess risks and mitigate them. Everyone gets scared, Lucien. Even people who've built their entire identity around control and strategic thinking. He was quiet for a long moment, and Alara watched him work through whether to actually engage with this conversation or shut it down completely. I married you because it was strategically sound, he said finally. But somewhere between signing the papers and watching you walk into buildings that might collapse, it stopped being purely strategic. I don't know when that happened or what to do about it, but pretending otherwise is starting to feel dishonest. The admission hung between them, more vulnerable than anything Alara had expected from him. She'd known the marriage was evolving beyond their original transactional agreement, but hearing Lucien acknowledge it made it real in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. I don't know what to do about it either, she said. I proposed to you out of anger and calculation, and now I'm investigating criminal operations and sleeping in your guest room and pretending I know what I'm doing. None of this was part of any plan. Do you regret it? Alara considered the question honestly. No. I regret how it started, and I regret that people got hurt, but I don't regret where we ended up. Does that make sense? Unfortunately, yes. They looked at each other across the living room, and Alara felt the careful distance they'd maintained start to dissolve. This wasn't strategic anymore. This was real and messy and more complicated than either of them had agreed to. Get some rest, Lucien said quietly. We'll figure out the rest later. Alara went to the bedroom they'd been theoretically sharing but mostly avoiding, and she was asleep within minutes of lying down. When she woke, it was early afternoon, and someone was knocking urgently on the door. Alara, Lucien's voice was tight. We have a problem. She found him in the office with Sarah, both of them looking at a laptop screen. Julian was there too, pale and tense. What happened? Alara asked. Sarah traced the ownership of Apex Technical Solutions, Lucien said. It took some work, but she tracked it through 3 shell companies and 2 offshore accounts. And? The ultimate owner is Diana Marrow, my mother. The words didn't make sense at first. Diana barely involved herself in company operations. She focused on charity work and social connections, leaving business to Malcolm and Lucien. The idea that she was running a criminal enterprise using company resources seemed absurd. There has to be a mistake, Julian said. Mother doesn't even understand half the company's operations. How could she be orchestrating something this sophisticated? Unless she's been hiding her understanding for years, Sarah said, or unless she has a partner who handles the technical aspects while she provides access and cover. Alara thought about Diana. Elegant, controlled, always impeccably appropriate. She'd seemed like the perfect society wife, supporting her husband's empire without needing to understand the mechanics. But what if that had been calculated performance? What if Diana had been playing a role while building something in the shadows? We need to confront her, Julian said. No, Lucien and Sarah said simultaneously. If we confront her without proof, she destroys evidence and we lose everything, Lucien continued. We need to understand the full scope of what she's doing before we make any moves. Then what do we do? Alara asked. Sarah pulled up a map showing all the riverside properties. We set a trap. We use the buildings themselves to draw out whoever's been accessing them. If Diana's involved, she'll need to respond, and when she does, we'll have proof. How? Julian asked. We stage a scenario that looks like we're about to demolish one of the secured buildings. We send out official notices, hire a demolition crew, make it look completely legitimate. If there's something valuable in those secured rooms, Diana or her associates will need to move it before the demolition happens. And we'll be watching, Lucien finished. Exactly. We document who accesses the property, what they remove, where they take it. Then we have concrete evidence connecting Diana to the illegal operation. It was smart, but it was also dangerous. If Diana realized what they were doing, she could eliminate evidence, or, worse, eliminate the people investigating her. There's something else, Sarah said. I've been reviewing the timeline of Julian's accident and the threatening message Alara received. Both happened within hours of you three meeting in Lucien's office, which means someone's monitoring your movements closely, either through direct surveillance or through access to your communications. The implication was clear. Someone in their immediate circle was feeding information to Diana. The leak could be anyone, staff, security, even family. We keep this plan between the four of us, Lucien said. No one else knows. We use separate devices to communicate. We don't discuss it in any location that might be monitored, and we assume everything we do is being watched until we identify the leak. They spent the next hour planning the operation. Sarah would arrange the demolition crew and permits. Lucien would send the official notices to all relevant parties. Julian would leak information suggesting they'd found nothing useful in their investigation and were moving forward with standard development plans. And Alara would prepare architectural assessments that recommended demolition for the building they were using as bait. Which property are we using? Alara asked. The one you visited first, Lucien said. The one with the most recent construction and the most severe structural damage. It's the most credible demolition target, and it's where you encountered people accessing the property. If there's something valuable there, they'll need to protect it. The plan was set for 48 hours from now. Enough time to make the demolition look legitimate, not so much time that Diana could relocate everything without being observed. Alara returned to her work, preparing the architectural assessment that would justify demolition. She documented every structural weakness, every code violation, every reason the building was unsafe and needed to come down immediately. The work was familiar and grounding, and she lost herself in the technical details until evening. She was reviewing her final draft when her phone rang. Violet's name appeared on the screen. Alara hadn't spoken to her sister since the engagement party. She'd deleted every message, ignored every call, built a wall of silence between them. But now, looking at Violet's name, she felt something shift. Curiosity, maybe, or the need for some kind of closure. She answered, Alara. Violet's voice was rough, like she'd been crying. Thank you for picking up. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure why I did. I need to tell you something. About Julian, about what happened, about... There's something you need to know. If this is an apology, I'm not interested. It's not an apology, or it is, but that's not why I'm calling. Alara, I think I made a terrible mistake, and I think you might be in danger because of it. Alara felt ice slide down her spine. What are you talking about? I can't explain over the phone. Can we meet? Somewhere private, somewhere no one will see us? Every instinct Alara had screamed that this was a trap. But Violet sounded genuinely frightened, and the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Fine, where? There's a coffee shop on the east side near the old textile district, corner of Madison and 8th. Can you be there in an hour? I'll be there. She hung up and found Lucien in his office, still reviewing financial documents. When she told him about the call, his expression went dark. You're not going alone. I wasn't planning to, but I need to hear what she has to say. This could be bait to draw you out. I know, but what if it's not? What if Violet knows something about Diana's operation? Lucien considered it, then nodded. We go together. Sarah provides backup, and if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately. They arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, with Sarah's team already positioned at strategic locations around the block. The shop was small and mostly empty, exactly the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be seen. Violet arrived exactly on time, looking nothing like the polished, confident woman Ilara remembered. She was pale, her eyes red from crying, her hands shaking as she ordered coffee she didn't drink. Thank you for coming, Violet said when they sat down. She looked at Lucien. Both of you. You said Ilara might be in danger, Lucien said. Explain. Violet took a shaky breath. Julian and it wasn't just an affair. We were working together on something. He was investigating irregularities in the Marrow accounts, and he needed someone outside the family to help document certain things. I have a gallery, I work with artists and collectors, I understand how to move valuable items discreetly. He thought I could help. Help with what? Ilara asked. He wanted to catch whoever was using Marrow properties for illegal storage. He thought if we could track what was being stored and where it was going, we could identify who was running the operation. But the more we investigated, the more dangerous it became. And then he realized someone in his own family was involved. Diana, Lucien said. Violet's eyes went wide. You know? We figured it out. What we don't know is what she's storing in those buildings. Art, Violet said quietly. Stolen art. Pieces from museum thefts, private collections, archaeological sites. She's been using the Marrow properties as secure storage while she arranges sales to private collectors. The engineering modifications you found, those are climate-controlled vaults designed to preserve valuable pieces. Ilara felt the final piece click into place. Art theft was a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry, and Diana had the perfect cover. A wealthy socialite with connections to museums, galleries, and private collectors worldwide. No one would question her attending auctions or visiting collections, and using her husband's company to provide secure storage was brilliantly ruthless. How long has this been going on? Lucien asked. Years. Maybe a decade. Julian found records going back at least that far. Diana's been building this operation slowly, carefully, using the Marrow name as cover while running a parallel criminal enterprise. And the affair? Ilara asked. Was that part of the investigation too? Violet met her eyes, and Ilara saw genuine pain there. No, that was real. I'm sorry, Ilara. I know how that sounds after everything else, but what happened between Julian and me, that wasn't calculated. It just happened, and it was selfish, and I hurt you terribly. But my feelings for him were real. Ilara didn't know how to process that. She'd spent weeks thinking Violet had betrayed her carelessly, but the truth was somehow worse. Violet had fallen in love with Julian while helping him investigate crimes, and the betrayal had been collateral damage to something more complicated than simple selfishness. Why are you telling us this now? Lucien asked. Because Diana knows. She found out Julian was investigating her, and that's why someone tried to run him off the road. And now she knows you're all working together, which means you're all targets. I'm telling you because I don't want anyone else getting hurt, because I helped Julian dig into something we couldn't control. Does Julian know you're here? Ilara asked. No. He thinks I'm done helping, that I'm too scared to stay involved. But I needed you to know what you're actually dealing with. Diana isn't going to let you expose her. She'll destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and burn everything down before she lets this operation get exposed. Lucien stood. We need to move up our timeline. If Diana knows we're investigating, she's already working to protect herself. Sarah, how fast can you get that demolition set up? Sarah, listening through her earpiece, replied immediately. 12 hours if we push it, but that gives Diana very little time to respond. That's the point. We force her hand before she can eliminate evidence. They left the coffee shop and drove straight back to Lucien's residence, where Julian was waiting. When they told him what Violet had revealed, he looked stricken. I should have told you she was helping me investigate, but I was trying to protect her, keep her out of it if everything went wrong. She's already in it, Lucien said. We all are. Now we need to finish this before Diana realizes we know exactly what she's doing. They worked through the night, coordinating the demolition, positioning Sarah's surveillance team, preparing for every possible scenario. By dawn, everything was in place. The demolition crew would arrive at the Riverside property in 6 hours. Diana would receive official notice in 4 hours, and they would be watching every move she made in response. Alara stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the city, and felt the weight of what they were about to do. They were preparing to expose Lucien's mother as a criminal, to destroy his family's reputation, to unravel years of carefully constructed lies. And once they started, there would be no going back. Lucien appeared beside her, looking exhausted but focused. Are you ready for this? No, Alara said honestly, but I don't think we have a choice anymore. We always have choices. We're just making the hard ones instead of the easy ones. Is that what this is, a hard choice? It's the right choice. Doesn't mean it's not hard. 4 hours later, the official demolition notice was sent to all relevant parties, including Diana Marrow. And then they waited, watching the surveillance feeds, monitoring the property, looking for any sign that Diana would take the bait. They didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours of receiving the demolition notice, Diana Marrow made her move. Sarah's surveillance team reported a black SUV arriving at the Riverside property at 11:30 in the morning, followed by a moving truck 15 minutes later. Diana herself wasn't there, but 3 men in professional attire were, and they moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Alara watched the surveillance feed from Lucien's office, her stomach tight with anticipation. This was it. They were about to get the evidence they needed to prove Diana's involvement in art theft and illegal operations using company resources. They're accessing the secured room now, Sarah reported through the comm system. 2 men inside, one supervising the truck. They're removing crates. Can you see what's in them? Lucien asked. Negative. Everything's packed and sealed, but the way they're handling them suggests valuable contents. They're being extremely careful. Julian stood near the window, watching the city without really seeing it. He'd been quiet since learning his mother was behind the operation, processing the reality that his entire family was more fractured than he'd realized. How long do we let this continue before we move in? He asked. Until they've removed everything and we can document where they're taking it, Lucien said. We need the full chain of custody to make the charges stick. The men worked for 90 minutes, removing 7 large crates from the secured room and loading them into the truck. Sarah's team photographed everything, documented the license plates, and tracked the men's movements with precision. When the truck finally pulled away, 2 unmarked vehicles followed at a careful distance. Now we wait, Sarah said. Let them lead us to wherever they're storing the art, and then we bring in the authorities. But 15 minutes later, Sarah's voice came through the comm system again, tight with tension. We have a problem. The truck just stopped at the Marrow estate. They're unloading the crates there. Alara felt her blood go cold. Diana was bringing stolen art directly to the family home, which meant she either felt completely secure in her operation or she was preparing for something drastic. She's destroying evidence, Lucien said. She's going to claim the art is part of the family's private collection, make it impossible to prove it was stolen. Or she's going to move it somewhere else entirely and use the estate as a temporary staging point, Julian added. Either way, we need to move now before we lose everything. Lucien made the call. Sarah, contact the authorities. Give them everything we have. And get your team to the estate immediately. I want every exit monitored. They drove to the Marrow estate with police following behind, a surreal convoy of family crisis and law enforcement that Alara had never imagined being part of. The gates were open when they arrived, as if Diana had been expecting them. They found her in the main salon, sitting calmly with a glass of wine, looking like she was hosting an afternoon social event rather than being confronted with evidence of years of criminal activity. The crates from the Riverside property were nowhere visible. Lucien, Diana said pleasantly. And Julian. And Alara. How lovely to see you again. I heard congratulations are in order on your marriage. though I must say the circumstances were somewhat unconventional. "Where's the art, Mother?" Lucien asked. Diana's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to." "The stolen art you've been storing in company properties. The operation you've been running for years using Father's access codes and company resources. The art that was just delivered here from the Riverside building." "You're making serious accusations based on what evidence exactly?" Sarah stepped forward. "Based on surveillance footage of your associates removing 7 crates from a secured facility in a Marrow property. Based on financial records showing payments to shell companies you own. Based on documentation of unauthorized construction in sealed buildings designed specifically for climate-controlled art storage." Diana set down her wine glass carefully. "I see. And you think this evidence proves what, exactly?" "That you've been running an international art theft operation," Julian said. "That you've been using our family's company as cover while stealing and selling pieces worth millions. That you tried to have me killed when I got too close to exposing you." For the first time, Diana's composure cracked. "I never authorized violence against you. That was—" She stopped, realizing she'd just confirmed her involvement. "That was what?" Lucien asked quietly. "That was your associates acting without permission? That was collateral damage you didn't intend?" Diana stood, and Alara saw the woman beneath the society polish, someone calculating, cornered, and still looking for an exit strategy. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Diana said. "This operation provides security for this family in ways you can't comprehend. The art world is built on wealth preservation and discrete transactions. I've been protecting our assets while your father threw money at legacy properties that bleed value." "You've been committing felonies," Lucien corrected, "and using company resources to do it, which means you've implicated all of us." "Only if anyone can prove the art is stolen, which will be remarkably difficult since the pieces are now part of our private collection, properly documented and acquired through legitimate channels according to all available records." She'd already covered her tracks. The art that had been removed from the Riverside property was now integrated into the estate's collection, with documentation that would be nearly impossible to disprove without extensive investigation. "You planned this," Alara said suddenly. "The demolition notice, you knew we'd be watching. You moved the art here specifically so you could claim it was always part of the family collection." Diana smiled, and it was cold. "You're quite clever, Alara. I can see why Lucien married you, strategy and all. Yes, I knew you were investigating. I knew you'd try to trap me with the demolition, so I used your trap against you. The art is now legally mine, documented and defended, and there's nothing you can do about it without years of litigation that will destroy this family's reputation and company value." "Unless we have proof it was stolen before you moved it here," Sarah said. She nodded to one of her team members, who brought out a tablet. "Unless we have photographs of these specific pieces from museum theft reports, private collection inventories, and archaeological documentation showing they were illegally removed from protected sites. Unless we have testimony from the people you hired to move them, who are currently being interviewed by federal authorities and are remarkably willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges." Diana's expression went very still. "You can't prove chain of custody. You can't prove those pieces in those photographs are the same pieces now in my collection. We can if they're still in the original crates with transportation documentation," Sarah said. "And we can if there are serial numbers, authentication marks, or distinctive features that experts can verify. The art world keeps very detailed records, Mrs. Marrow. Almost as detailed as the records you kept of your transactions." The silence that followed was absolute. Diana looked between them, and Alara watched her calculate whether she could still talk her way out of this or if she'd finally been cornered completely. "Where's Malcolm?" Diana asked quietly. "At his club," Lucien said, "where I told him to stay until this was resolved. He doesn't need to see this." "How considerate of you to protect him from watching his family implode." "I'm protecting him from being implicated in your crimes. He had nothing to do with this operation." "Didn't he?" Diana's smile was bitter now. "Your father has always been remarkably good at not seeing what he doesn't want to see. You think he didn't notice the unauthorized access? The irregular accounts? The convenient way properties became available for my use? He knew, Lucien. He just chose not to ask questions because the money was good, and it kept me occupied with something other than his inadequacies. Julian looked stricken. That's not true. Father would never condone theft. Your father condones whatever serves his interests, just like both of you do, just like Alara did when she married Lucien to avoid humiliation. We're all calculating people making strategic choices. I just happen to be better at it than you gave me credit for. Police officers entered the salon then, and Diana's opportunity for exit strategies evaporated. Sarah directed them to the crates, which had been moved to a climate-controlled storage area in the estate's lower level. Art theft investigators would need to verify the pieces, but the evidence was substantial and damning. Diana Merrow, one of the officers said, "You're under arrest for theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and illegal transportation of stolen property. You have the right to remain silent." Diana held up one hand. "I know my rights, and I know my attorney's number. This conversation is over." They took her out in handcuffs, and Alara watched Lucien's face remain carefully neutral throughout the entire process. Only when his mother was gone did something crack in his expression. Not grief exactly, but a kind of exhausted recognition that his family would never be the same. Julian left without saying anything, unable to process what had just happened. That left Alara and Lucien standing in the salon while investigators cataloged evidence and police secured the premises. "I should feel something," Lucien said finally. "Satisfaction that we caught her. Anger that she did this. Something. But all I feel is tired." Alara moved closer to him. "You just arrested your mother. I think tired is the least complicated emotion you're entitled to." She was right about one thing. We're all calculating people making strategic choices. I married you strategically. You married me for revenge. We've both been operating from self-interest this entire time. Is that what you think we've been doing? Isn't it? Alara thought about the last 2 weeks, the investigation, the danger, the gradual shift from strategic alliance to something more complicated and real. She thought about Lucien's worry when she'd gone into that first building alone, about the way he'd included her in the investigation despite it being safer to push her away, about the exhaustion in his voice right now that suggested he was finally letting her see beneath the control. "Maybe that's how it started," she said, "but I don't think that's where we are anymore. Where are we then?" "I don't know. But I know I didn't investigate criminal operations and risk my safety because of strategic calculations. I did it because your problems became my problems, and I cared about protecting what we were building together. Even if I wasn't ready to admit that until now." Lucien looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. "I told myself I was protecting a business asset when I pulled you from the investigation, that I was mitigating risks and protecting company interests. But Catherine was right. I was just scared something would happen to you, and I didn't know how to process that without turning it into strategy. So we're both terrible at acknowledging when something matters beyond calculations." Apparently so. They stood there in the wreckage of his family's scandal, and Alara felt the careful walls they'd both maintained finally collapse completely. This marriage had started as transaction and revenge, but somewhere between the anger and the investigation and the gradual trust, it had become something neither of them had planned for. "What happens now?" Alara asked. "Now we deal with the fallout. Diana will be prosecuted, the company will take a reputation hit, and the family will fracture in ways that probably can't be repaired. Malcolm will have to answer questions about what he knew and when. Julian will have to decide whether he can forgive himself for not seeing this sooner. And we figure out what we actually want this marriage to be now that we're not running on crisis and strategy." Lucien nodded. "That sounds terrifying." "It is, but also maybe better than the alternative." The investigation and prosecution took months. Diana pleaded guilty to multiple counts of art theft and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she was still facing years in federal prison. The art was returned to its rightful owners, though some pieces had been sold to private collectors who fought to keep them, claiming they'd purchased in good faith. Malcolm retired completely from the company, unable to face the reality that his wife had been running a criminal empire while he'd ignored the signs. He and Diana were divorcing, and the proceedings were ugly and public. The Merrow name took a hit, but Lucien managed the crisis with the same calculated precision he applied to everything else, and eventually the company stabilized. Julian took a position at a smaller firm, wanting distance from the family drama. He and Violet were still together, navigating their own complicated path forward. Alara had forgiven neither of them completely, but she'd reached a kind of acceptance that what had happened between them was real, even if it had started in betrayal. Through all of it, Alara and Lucien learned how to be married for real instead of strategically. It wasn't smooth or perfect. Lucien still retreated into control when he was overwhelmed, and Alara still calculated options instead of admitting vulnerability. But they were learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to let each other in. 6 months after Diana's arrest, Alara finished the final documentation on the Riverside project. The historically significant buildings were being restored with proper funding and expert consultation. Her name was on the project as lead preservation architect, and the work was getting recognition in professional journals. She was reviewing the final plans when Lucien came into her office. She'd claimed one of the rooms in his residence and turned it into proper workspace, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "I have news," he said. "Good news or complicated news?" "Both." The board approved the foundation. They'd been planning it for months, a foundation dedicated to arts education and cultural preservation, funded partially by the recovered stolen art that couldn't be returned to original owners. It was Alara's idea, a way to take something criminal and transform it into something that actually helped people. "That's good news," Alara said. "What's the complicated part?" "The board wants you to run it. Full oversight, strategic direction, everything. It would mean stepping back from some of your architectural projects." Alara had expected the offer, but hearing it made real was different. This was a chance to build something meaningful, to use her strategic thinking and architectural knowledge in service of something bigger than individual projects. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "I think you should make the choice that serves what you actually want, not what you think you should want, or what fits some strategic plan." "And what if I don't know what I actually want?" "Then we figure it out together. That's what partners do." Partners. Not strategic allies or convenient marriages or calculated arrangements. Partners who chose each other deliberately and built something real from the wreckage of their original plans. "I'll take the position," Alara said, "on the condition that we establish clear boundaries between foundation work and company operations. I'm not interested in being the CEO's wife who runs a vanity project. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it legitimately. I wouldn't expect anything less. When have you ever done anything that wasn't legitimate and probably over-prepared? I married you with 12 hours of planning. That was neither legitimate nor prepared. Fair point. That was possibly the least calculated decision either of us has ever made. And somehow the best one." Lucien set down his wine glass and moved closer, and Alara recognized the expression on his face, the one that said he was about to be honest in a way that cost him something. "I love you," he said. "I don't know when it happened or how to quantify it in strategic terms, but I love you. And I need you to know that before we go any further with foundations or projects or any other plans. Because I'm not doing any of this for strategy anymore. I'm doing it because building a life with you is what I actually want." Alara felt something unlock in her chest, the last piece of protection she'd been holding on to, the final wall between who she'd been and who she was becoming. "I love you too," she said. "Which is terrifying because I didn't plan for it, and I can't control it, and it makes everything more complicated. But it's also the most honest thing I've felt in years." He kissed her then. And it wasn't strategic or calculated or part of any plan. It was just real and imperfect and exactly what they both needed. 3 years later, Alara stood in front of a room full of donors and board members presenting the foundation's annual report. They'd restored 4 historic properties, funded scholarships for 50 students, and established partnerships with museums and cultural institutions across the country. The foundation was thriving, and her name was associated with meaningful work that actually mattered. Lucien sat in the front row, watching her with the same assessing look he'd had that first night on the terrace when she'd proposed something insane. But now she understood what that look meant. It was how he showed attention and respect, how he indicated someone had his full focus. After the presentation, they drove home together, and Alara felt the satisfaction of work done well settle over her. She'd built something that mattered. She'd taken the chaos of her broken engagement and Diana's criminal operation and transformed it into opportunities for people who needed them. "You were brilliant tonight," Lucien said. I was adequately prepared and reasonably articulate. You were brilliant. Stop deflecting compliments. Fine. I was brilliant. Happy? Very. They pulled up to the house. Alara had stopped calling it Lucien's residence and started calling it home sometime in the second year of their marriage. Inside, evidence of their actual life together had accumulated. Her architectural drawings scattered across the dining table, his financial reports stacked on the kitchen counter, photographs from the trip they'd taken to survey restoration sites in Europe. I have something for you, Lucien said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Alara opened it and found property documents for a building in the Arts District, a beautiful early 20th century structure that had been on her list of dream restoration projects for years. You bought this? She asked. The foundation bought it, but I may have influenced the decision by pointing out that the lead architect has been obsessing over this building since before we got married. This is manipulation. This is strategy in service of making you happy. There's a difference. Alara looked at the documents, then at Lucien, then back at the documents. This building represented everything she'd wanted professionally. A chance to restore something meaningful, to bring her expertise to a project that mattered, to leave a legacy beyond just strategic partnerships and calculated decisions. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome. Though I should mention there's a condition. Of course there is. What condition? The restoration has to include accessible studio space for local artists. The foundation board was very specific about that requirement. Let me guess. You were very specific about that requirement. I may have suggested it strongly. Alara smiled, recognizing the pattern. Lucien was still strategic and calculating, but now those qualities served partnership instead of just self-interest. He'd learned to use his considerable talents to build something together instead of just protecting himself. I can work with that condition, she said. Good, because I have another one. How many conditions are there? Just one more. The dedication plaque has to include both our names. Not because I'm your husband or because I funded the project, but because we're partners in this. In all of this. Partners. The word that had come to define their marriage more than any strategic calculation ever could. They'd started as transaction and revenge, but they'd built something real from that foundation, messy and imperfect and more honest than anything either of them had planned for. Deal, Alara said. That night, lying in bed with Lucien's arm around her and restoration plans already forming in her mind, Alara thought about the engagement party 3 years ago. She thought about watching Julian touch Violet and feeling her careful plans collapse. She thought about walking up to Lucien on that terrace and proposing something desperate and strategic. If someone had told her then that she'd end up here, genuinely married to Lucien, running a foundation she cared about, building a life that mattered, she would have thought they were delusional. None of this was what she'd planned. It was better. Are you thinking strategically about the restoration project? Or are you just not sleeping? Lucien asked quietly. Both. Also thinking about how nothing turned out the way I expected. Is that a complaint? No, it's an observation. I planned a safe, appropriate marriage to Julian. I ended up with a complicated, messy marriage to you. And somehow, the second option is infinitely better than the first ever would have been. Because you're a terrible judge of what you actually want? Because I'm better at strategy than I am at acknowledging what I need. But I'm learning. We're both learning. Lucien pulled her closer, and Alara felt the security of being chosen deliberately, not as strategic advantage, but as genuine partnership. They'd built this together from crisis and calculation, and it had become something neither of them had expected. Real love that survived imperfection and actually meant something. I have one more confession, Lucien said. Should I be worried? Probably. That night you proposed to me, I knew you were using me for revenge. I knew it was strategic and desperate and possibly the worst foundation for a marriage anyone had ever suggested. And you said yes anyway. Because I saw something in you that I recognized. Someone who was done being appropriate and safe. Someone who was ready to burn everything down and rebuild from the ashes. I didn't fall in love with you that night, but I saw the potential for it. And I was right. Alara turned to face him in the darkness, seeing the man who'd agreed to marry her strategically and then spent 3 years learning how to love her honestly. We're both terrible at this, she said. At what? at being married, at being vulnerable, at admitting we care about things beyond strategic advantage. We're both disasters at actual human connection. True, but we're disasters together, which somehow makes it work. That's not how marriage is supposed to work. Maybe not, but it's how our marriage works, and that's enough. He was right. This wasn't the perfect love story or the fairy tale ending. This was two calculating, strategic people who'd chosen each other in anger and desperation, then done the hard work of transforming that choice into something real. It was messy and imperfect and more honest than anything either of them had experienced before. And it was theirs. Alara kissed him, feeling gratitude for the chaos that had brought them together and the work they'd done to build something meaningful from it. She'd started as the practical choice, the appropriate option, the woman who did everything right and got betrayed anyway. She'd ended up as someone who took risks, made hard choices, and built a life that actually mattered, not because she'd planned it perfectly, but because she'd been willing to rebuild when everything fell apart. "I love you," she said. "I know. I'm strategically irresistible. You're strategically insufferable, but yes, also irresistible." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in the home they'd built together, with restoration plans and foundation reports waiting for morning and a future that belonged entirely to them. It wasn't the ending Alara had planned 3 years ago, but it was infinitely better, real and honest and built on partnership instead of just calculation. And in the quiet aftermath of scandal and investigation and gradual healing, they'd created something neither of them had known they needed. A marriage that wasn't about being appropriate or strategic or safe, but about choosing each other deliberately every single day and building a life that mattered to them both.